But they really like beekeeping because when you teach people beekeeping, you don't have to give them any expensive widgets or anything. You just send a beekeeping expert who tells them how to make beehives and how to take care of bees, and you can help them out a whole lot. But they increase the income among the community by 62%, and they can, somewhere up here it says they can now buy books and medication and send their kids to school. And when I read that in the impact report, and then in a number of the impact reports, it says things like this. I'm just like, wow, if I can help a group of people, a whole village, increase their income by 60% and send their kids to school, that's pretty amazing. So I like doing it because it's fun, but also once I read that, I'm like, I'm doing this as much as I can because I just feel blessed that I can do something like that for people. All right, so this appears to be loading. So my name is Kris. I've lived in Australia for 2 years now. Before that, I was in the United States. I am a professional beekeeper. I've been a professional beekeeper for about 10 years, and I was like a hobbyist for about 10 years before that. And what I really like to do is during the winter, when the beekeeping is slow, I travel abroad to teach beekeeping abroad. All right, so yes, so I teach beekeeping abroad. Most of these projects are sponsored by the United States Agency for International Development. So they come up with the money, and there's various non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that administer the projects. And so they're all kind of under the general heading of farmer-to-farmer programs. They also do dairy and goats and all kinds of things. But they really like beekeeping because when you teach people beekeeping, you don't have to give them any expensive widgets or anything. You just send a beekeeping expert who tells them how to make beehives and how to take care of bees, and you can help them out a whole lot. So I've got a lot I plan on covering, so I'm just going to jump right into it, sort of. So I usually do about 3 projects a year. Usually a lot of them are in Africa, but this year I went to Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, which is what this shows on the map, and Nicaragua in Central America. And so I'm going to talk about Kyrgyzstan first because it's kind of the least different, and then I'm going to talk about Nigeria, Guinea, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and then I just tacked Nicaragua briefly on the end because it's my most recent project. So this is where Kyrgyzstan is. It is kind of high altitude, the edge of the Himalayas, borders with China. Really interesting place because you have these kind of Asian looking people with this Turkish culture and this Russian political history. So it's this interesting mix of things. Culturally very interesting. The beekeeping, everywhere you go, the bees tend to be different because you got a lot of different subspecies of honeybees. And so one of the kind of big themes I'm going to keep coming back to is what works for us here doesn't work for people everywhere. And so these bees, first thing that was very interesting is, how do I turn the little red light on? The bees didn't seem to have gotten the memo that stinging is a thing that bees can do. They would sometimes not even blow smoke on the bees and then just pull out a frame to show it around. Or they might at most have puffed like a little whiff of it. And you see kids, non-beekeepers, are just hanging around. These bees do not mind that we just pulled a frame out and are showing it around. All the beehives they use are these giant kind of ice chest sized things. I think they have like 3 beehives in them in the winter, and then they, I think, spread them out more during the summer. And it's one of those things where I would say if someone was making a beehive like that here, I'd be like, you're doing it all wrong, you need to make it smaller. But I think since it's much colder there, this might be what they need to do to keep the bees alive through the cold winter. And you can see the frame is kind of similar to ours, and she's kind of short, but that's still a huge frame. She was my translator. Yeah, and then you get weird things like with this particular group, when the beekeeping expert is coming, they don't want to have, they have varroa mites there, and they don't want to have an embarrassing amount of varroa mites. And so they treated for mites, probably for the first time ever or something, the day before I showed up, overdosed the bees, all the bees were dead. And so I get there, I'm like, you've just got dead bees. So we looked at a lot of other people's bees and things, but that family was supposed to be the core group. They just killed all their bees. So let's talk about not overdosing your bees with medication is kind of what I talked about a lot with them. And I kept talking about, if you make your beehives smaller, you can move them more. And, describing our beehives, like, again, like I can't tell them it'll work for them, maybe it won't, but here's the thing you can try. They're like, oh no, we got these. And they showed me these, which are smaller than the other ones, and they can stack them on top. But I'm like, oh, that still doesn't look very mobile. This was a really beautiful bee trailer I saw one guy had. You can see he's got 60 beehives on each side, and of course bees, if everything looks the same, they get confused. Bees can only really count to 3 counting from the edge of something. But if you have colorful squares and circles and triangles, then the bees can distinguish it. And even here, that's a good idea if you have a row of 10 beehives. Paint big, simple shapes on them, helps the bees a lot. And this was really cool because inside this, it was hard to get a good picture of the inside because it was so cramped in there. But there's a divider, and then this back thing has 2 bunks, an extractor, which has a desk that folds over the extractor when he needs a workbench, and it drains to some honey tanks under the trailer. So this is like everything you need in the beekeeping operation in a trailer. So that one is really cute. This is what you see all over Kyrgyzstan. They seem to have a lot of beekeepers. And what's interesting is even though they're selling honey for less than the price that we're selling honey for here, because the cost of living is so much less there, I think I was told there's about 100 hives here, and this supports a family of about 4. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could support myself with 100 beehives. That would be really living it easy. But also, I guess theft is a problem. They always have to keep these things fully manned at all times. So there's always like a little trailer on the front that's got a little bunk bed or 2, and these things are always manned 24/7. So it's kind of weird where beekeeping there is 100 hives on a trailer, keeping someone there all the time. They typically, in the spring, there's lots of wildflowers in the mountains, so they all take their bee trailers up and they usually have like a family home in the village in the winter, and then in the spring, the guys are out kind of camping in these things. This is a little nuke box, a little mating nuke we call it, so even smaller than your nuke. It's got kind of 5 subsections with queens for queen mating. People knew how to do queen mating, but another kind of weird thing I encountered is even though there seemed to be a lot of experienced beekeepers, they all were always ordering queens from Italy or Ukraine at I don't know what kind of cost compared to everything else. And I don't know. I kept telling them, why don't you breed your own queens and sell them to other beekeepers? And they kept saying, oh, they're not good enough, not good enough. But I feel like this is just kind of an idea they have in their head. They don't have confidence in their bees because I don't see why they couldn't. And this was another really funny thing. I had to take a picture because especially I'm based in Geelong ways, and one of the old grizzly beekeepers who talks a lot at all the meetings keeps saying, any amount of alcohol in your hive will kill the bees. Don't feed them, don't give them back the stickies after extraction because it will start to ferment and kill all your bees. Personally, I think putting stickies back in a hive for even a day or 2 so they clean it up is the best way to clean it up and not have a mess. This guy swears any alcohol will kill the bees. This guy pours vodka in his hives so that he swears that it aids in the acceptance of queens. I don't think it's pure vodka. I hope it's watered down with water because it seems like your bees would get wildly drunk with that. But this isn't just some crazy harebrained idea. He's like a 4th generation beekeeper, so obviously it doesn't kill his bees. But it's definitely another thing is, all beekeepers have different ideas about what works and what doesn't work, and you just kind of got to travel around with an open mind. Don't become convinced that one thing is the right way because you'll meet someone that does something completely different. I also thought this was very cliche because this family, they're actually Russians, even though they're in Kyrgyzstan, and I'm just like, not to perpetuate Russian stereotypes, but of course they're giving their bees vodka. So,
extra buzzy bees?
Yeah, these very happy bees. This was a beautiful kind of, took the same idea of the bee trailer but made it permanent. So this is kind of a solid wall of beehives, and then you can access the beehives from these kind of things that fold out on the inside. And so just a kind of beautiful setup he had there. Queen rearing, just again, you can see some pretty advanced practices going on there. They know how to do queen rearing. I need to include in this picture, I don't have any pictures. These yurts, like you imagine the Mongols living in, I don't have any pictures in the slideshow, but especially when they're up with their bees in the summer, people are actually living in these yurts the way they have for like 1,000 years, which I think is pretty amazing. Okay, so now moving on to Africa, where I've kind of done most of my work. This is Nigeria. This is the first place I went, and I've been there 3 times. It is the most populous part of Africa. So you notice the population density is pretty high there. This is what your African beekeepers look like. You see a lot of homemade bee suits, and then I really like this guy. He just kind of pulls what he's wearing anyway up over his eyes and goes with it. I see, and so top bar hives is pretty much what we're working with throughout Africa, because you got to understand they don't even have any power bandsaws or something to make frames. Anything you're cutting with a handsaw. So instead of cutting, four pieces for every frame and all that, it just makes so much more sense to make top bar hives. I always like to say, if you think you know something about top bar hives, you might say that this is clearly built wrong because it's got the flat sides. Here you are taught that you need to build it with the 60-degree sides because your European bees will adhere to a vertical surface, but the 60 degrees, they can't decide if it's vertical or not. And so most beehives in Africa are the Kenyan-style top bar hives with the 60-degree sides. But what works for European bees does not necessarily go the same for African bees. And apparently in Tanzania, they discovered that if, hey, we just be lazy and build the vertical sides, African bees don't adhere to a vertical side anyway. And so while most people are putting all this extra effort into making these 60-degree sides, it doesn't appear to be necessary. So that's just another lesson of where people took what they thought they knew coming from Europe and went there, and it's not necessarily the right, perfect thing. Also, it's kind of off the picture here, but they obviously can't just go to the store and buy a smoker, and so here they have just put something smoking into kind of a coffee can size thing and put it under the hive to smoke it. Definitely does not work as well as being able to blow the thing into the box, but and some people make it's not that hard to make a smoker, so I've seen people making them there, but it's not something you can do super easily. Especially in Nigeria, there's no tradition of beekeeping. I found everybody was just terrified of the bees. And I find that if you have a mortal fear of your bees, you're going to be apprehensive about opening it. I've noticed on many of my projects, especially in Nigeria, for the first 5 days I'm there, they keep coming up with excuse after excuse about why we cannot open the beehives today. And you cannot be a beekeeper and be afraid of your bees. And so one of the things I do is because African bees can be a bit more aggressive than nice, docile Italian bees. And so I always approach fully suited up and all that. But as soon as I see they're not buzzing like they're angry, they're not angry, I take off my gloves. And the first time I do that, they're like, oh. But then they see I do that, and then of course, then they want to do that. And I think that's great to have people that are comfortable with the bees see that they're not constantly going to rip their face off. Being comfortable with the bees is key to working with the bees. If you're afraid of them, you're always going to come up with excuses not to work on them, and I want people to be comfortable with the bees. Also, when I get there, they're typically just discarding the beeswax. On the international market, beeswax actually goes for more than honey does. Here, if I was going to do something with beeswax, I'd obviously buy a candle mold or something, but you can't go and buy a candle mold there. So this first project of mine in Nigeria, we tried a few different things. We tried filling these fluorescent light bulb tubes with wax or corrugate or PVC pipe, all these various things. But it turns out what worked the best and was readily available pretty much everywhere in Africa is these are papaya spears, also papas sometimes. And so the plant kind of builds up this woody stalk and then sticks out these spears, and you cut them into kind of however long you want, and they're hollow inside, and they're just perfect. You fill it with wax, bury the bottom end in some sand or something, let it harden, and then you can just peel off the thing, and you've got a cute little candle. And you can see we're pouring it from a bottle cut in half. So, they say necessity is the mother of innovation, and it's really true that you see all these, we can just buy anything we need here, but you see people coming up with ways to solve problems there. The biggest problem in Nigeria is because everyone is afraid of bees. They typically, like I said, they're fairly overpopulated, so they've got everybody's on a quarter acre that they're trying to farm enough to support their family out of. And so even if you have bees and you're not terrified of them, your neighbor three houses down is less than 100 meters away, and he's telling you he's going to come and kill all your bees tonight if you don't do anything about it. So instead, they end up putting the beehives way beyond the village over the hill where no one can be bothered by them. But then someone else, they always blame the Fulani herdsmen. There's nomadic herdsmen. I don't want to necessarily assume that they're right, not just being prejudiced, but the nomadic people, they allege, come and destroy their beehives. So then they have to lock them down. And so these, you see, are heavily locked down. And the day we went out there, they had forgotten their keys, so you couldn't even open these beehives. But it was interesting, kind of like ethnic tension in action. One beehive we went to, the Fulani herdsmen were there actually among the beehives, and people always just started throwing rocks and chasing them away. And I was like, oh, this is kind of awkward and strange. But, and so this is a big blob of text, but I included this here because after my first project, I was like, oh, that was fun, but I kind of assumed, I'm very cynical, I assumed they kind of shook their head and went back to what they were doing. But the organizations that put these on, they do a baseline survey before the project, and then a year later they do the impact report. And I got the impact report from that first project, and how do I get the lasers? What button does it? The red one. Ah, there we go. But they increased the income among the community by 62%, and they can, somewhere up here it says they can now buy books and medication and send their kids to school. And when I read that in the impact report, and then in a number of the impact reports, it says things like this. I'm just like, wow, if I can help a group of people, a whole village, increase their income by 60% and send their kids to school, that's pretty amazing. So I like doing it because it's fun, but also once I read that, I'm like, I'm doing this as much as I can because I just feel blessed that I can do something like that for people. So the other place I've gone to a lot is Guinea. There's like a dozen countries in the world that have Guinea in some part of their name. You got Equatorial Guinea here. This is also Guinea-Bissau, but this is Guinea. And there's Papua New Guinea over here. And so it's much more rural, lots of rain. It's a thing. These are Guinean beekeepers. This is the beekeeping club of a village whose name I forget. This is a traditional beehive. Everywhere I go, typically they got some modern beehives, by which they mean top bars, and usually about 90% of the beehives owned by the farmers are traditional beehives. This one I think is woven together. Often you see them, they're just hollowed out logs. Sometimes they're woven more like a basket. Typically they're one-offs. You put it up in a tree, bees come into it, and then you kill it and take the honey once a year. The way of getting bees is pretty much you put hives up in trees and you just get bees. African bees in general tend to abscond a lot more than European bees. So if they don't like the weather, if it's not food on, they up and leave. And basically what you do in Africa is you don't really fight that. You don't feed your bees over winter, which would be the dry season there. You let your bees leave, and then you don't have to take care of them. And you pretty much, if you have well-situated, good hives, you can get nearly all of them repopulated the next time the season comes on and the bees come back. So it's actually kind of good. You don't have to look after them when it's not food on. This is just a picture of a good top bar hive with a good piece of capped comb. Usually when I get there, they are kind of trying to do it, but the frames aren't the right sizes, and often they're harvesting the uncapped honey, or even just all the brood and everything they're mashing together. So those are the simplest things are the biggest keys that I have to drill into them. Don't do this. But yeah, so for example, this is probably improperly sized. You can see this one's so much smaller than that one. With the African bees, the top bars have to be 32 millimeters in width, and that's kind of the one really, really key detail. And then also, even if oftentimes they just don't inspect them very much. And I'll tell them, even if everything's perfect with it, if you don't inspect it very often, they'll start to do this. But if you inspect fairly regularly, you can catch things starting to go the wrong way, and you break it and they fix it. So 32 millimeters is the key width. How are you going to measure this when you've got no tools at all? It turns out 32 millimeters is the width of a Coke bottle cap, or it looks like a Fanta bottle cap. And so that's really fun because those are everywhere, and I always just pick one up on the village on the way to the bee yard, and I'm like, let me get out my technical tool. This one is not right. And you can see this one is a fair bit bigger. It looks like it's maybe 2 millimeters there and another millimeter there, and obviously they've got the triple combing there. And I always tell them, okay, now we've got to fix this. So you got to break off the pieces that are not properly attached and fix everything while we're there. Now what do we do? Because I was telling them, in the United States, in Australia, I'd have a frame, I'd put rubber bands, I'd stick the comb in. Obviously we don't have a frame, we don't have rubber bands. How are we going to fix this? And then one of the guys is like, oh, I got this. And he turns around, strips some vine off a nearby tree and adhere it to that. And if you have a broken comb and you manage to stick it in like that, the bees will fix the gap. Don't open that for 2 weeks probably, because it will be fragile, but then they'll build up and fix it. And again, I just love coming up with these solutions to fix things without the modern rubber bands and things. Here's some candles we made. This one is from the papaya, and this one is from a piece of pipe or something. PVC pipe doesn't work very well. It's hard to get it open again without breaking the candle. We also, candles are all good and well, but I also usually teach them how to make lotions and creams and things, and it's pretty easy. It's just beeswax, some kind of vegetable oil or coconut oil or peanut oil, and I like to put aloe vera in it. But basically everything is at hand. It's pretty simple, and I feel like that will sell really readily in the village market and things. So here we are making that stuff. And I also just love the way they dress over there. I feel like, these are all like teenage kids compared to teenage kids here. I feel like they're so much more elegantly dressed. Here they are trying out the lotion. There's a lot of downtime in Africa. You can't go home and watch the TV. And so we actually spend a lot of our time sitting on the porch. Here it rains a lot in Guinea, so here it's raining. And we've got the battery-powered radio to connect us to the world. And we just spend a lot of time sitting on the porch. And it's really kind of a fun, different pace of life. We're all hanging out there. And it's also very family-oriented, because the family village, all the kids are running to get around together in one big mob. As you're sitting on your porch, your cousin or brother or uncle comes by and you say hey, and pretty much all the guys end up on someone's porch chatting. And it seems like such a fun social environment. And so... No, typically not. Yeah, in Guinea, on a day-to-day basis in the interior, they're speaking Pula, which is the local language there, or French. And I speak just petit français, so I can kind of vaguely catch what they're saying. And then every now and then, if it sounds interesting, I'll elbow. This guy, Monsieur Damba, was my translator, so I'll elbow him and be like, what are they saying? But yeah, in Nigeria, even if they're speaking English, I usually can't understand. They've got a thick Nigerian accent. Yeah, so this was funny, because this kid, this is Mamadou something or other. He's like 6, and he just, as soon as we come back from beekeeping, he'd run over and hold my smoker, and here he's put on my bee suit and my boots. And so he'll be a beekeeper someday, I'm sure. All right, so the next interesting place I went to is Ethiopia, which, as you can see, is the east side of Africa. Before I went to Ethiopia, I had kind of this picture of like desert wastelands. There's starving people in Ethiopia. And I think this area, which borders Somalia, I assume looks like that. Haven't been there. This looks, I think, more like your typical savanna. And the rest of this brown stuff, the brown represents high altitude. It's all mountainous. Addis Ababa, the capital, is high altitude. I get there and it was like cool and rainy. Where I was working, you can see it's pine trees and mountains. These are your typical Ethiopian farmers. Average monthly income, $12 a month. One of them was admiring my gloves, and I was like, oh yeah, these were only like $4. He's like, oh, I couldn't afford that. I'm like, take my gloves. It's just weird, because you know that there's a difference in income for us and them kind of in your head, but then you go there. I was talking to someone with a bachelor degree in law, well-spoken, in every degree, felt like my peer, and she makes $50 a month, and I'm just like, life is not fair. They have a long tradition of beekeeping in Ethiopia. They have traditionally these woven basket hives. One side is bigger than the other. The entrance is in the smaller end. It's kind of, I don't know what's going on over here, but they typically have kind of looks like a basket lid on the backside, and they can take it off. And in a top bar hive or a hive like this, the bees tend to make the brood towards the entrance and the honey behind it. So you open the back end, you can take the honey until you get to the brood and stop there. And so they knew all these things, but how to, they don't destroy a hive once a year like in most places in Africa. And they've got ways of introducing queens and catching swarms and pretty much even practically queen rearing. Like they had a traditional way of doing everything. The Queen of Sheba is said to have brought honey to King Solomon. Sheba is Ethiopia and a piece of Yemen. And so the history of beekeeping in Ethiopia clearly goes back to biblical times even. And you can tell they just have this, they will, during the winter, they take the beehives into the kitchen to keep them warm. They'll carry them on their shoulder down to the market to sell them, and they could always tell me what the going rate for beehives in the local market was. Here's another typical farmhouse with a bunch of them on the eaves there. It's kind of interesting. You have different problems. In Nigeria, problem is complete lack of familiarity with bees and fear of the bees. Here, they're not afraid of the bees, obviously. But where Nigerians were really open to practically anything I said, here, I'm talking to a group of 50 farmers. I'm like the youngest person in the room. They've been beekeeping for countless generations. Sometimes it's hard to convince them of something. I'd speak for 10 minutes. My translator would speak for 10 minutes. The guy in the back speaking for 20 minutes. And I'm like, what's he saying? Oh, he disagrees with you. Okay. And not everywhere, but like in one area, I could not convince them to even let me demonstrate that you can blow smoke on a beehive to calm them down. They were convinced smoke would make the bees angry. And no, you're not even going to demonstrate this because then the bees will be angry and stinging everyone. And I'm just like, just let me demonstrate. No. And so you get these people that are set in their beliefs, and it's not much you can do. I think we compromised in going just at sunset, and that was the best I could get, because they would do it at night. In a lot of Africa, they do their beekeeping at night, but I feel like bees are even worse at night, because they just crawl up all into your bee suit and just all over you, and I think it's really obnoxious. Throughout Africa, a lot of the beehives are not far from villages, and like I said, even with the smoke thing, it kind of stirred up. So I do tend to do beekeeping in Africa about an hour before sunset. So there's still light, but if the bees do get stirred up, they're not going to be raging all day. Here is a bunch of kind of traditional beehives and some more modern ones. They also like to have these gourds or calabashes that they get bees to live in, and that's kind of their source of swarms. Because you can't really do a split on these things, but if you have a really space-constrained hive, like in a gourd, it'll just spit out swarms, and then you catch them in your bait hives. So that's a thing. The other thing is these hives, it looks like a Langstroth box or something. It's a specific type called a Zander hive, which is functionally the same except for the dimensions, I think. And basically, someone had this great idea. Ethiopia has this whole big government mentality. So they decided to organize unemployed youth to produce like 60,000 of these things every year and give them to the beehives for free or super subsidized. But the problem is the beekeepers don't know how to use these. They don't know what's improperly made and they should reject, and the people that are making them don't know how to make them right. So the wires were super floppy and the things were kind of not quite spaced right. And even just the idea, I feel like it's over-engineered, because with this, you see the sides are kind of telescoped over each other, so if it gets propolis together, you can't get a hive tool in there to break it apart. And even it's kind of fancy entrance with a sliding thing. I was telling them there's nothing wrong with that except that it's over-engineered. It unnecessarily increases your cost of your beehive when people have $12 a month. So you don't need that. But here you can see someone's got a whole bunch of them. You see a lot of these things everywhere. All painted yellow, it's the thing there. This is just a queen cage. You can see they just split some bamboo, put the queen in there and stuff a corn cob in the top, and voila, you've got a super easy queen cage. Other interesting problems, we go over there and I can't really tell, there's too much light, but there's a baboon or some kind of monkey hanging out the side of the bee yard. I don't think the monkeys were a problem, but they have lots of problems with the honey badgers everywhere I go, especially in East Africa. They always ask me, what do we do about honey badgers? And I have to tell them, I'm sorry, I am not a honey badger expert. They're really hard. This picture I just included because I thought it was a cute picture. This is a bunch of village children in Ethiopia. It was funny because I don't think I'd ever seen a digital camera before. They were getting a real kick out of me taking a picture and then showing it to them, and they thought that was pretty amazing. All right, so all the other projects were I was recruited as the technical expert by these other organizations. And then I attended a beekeeping conference in Arusha up there in the north of Tanzania. And just attended this conference just for fun, like one does. And some representatives for a group of hunter-gatherers down in Singida came and spoke just briefly and basically said, we are poor, please help us. Someone had given them 100 beehives, but no training at all. They had no training. They didn't know what to do with them. And the thing is, and the Hadza people, these hunter-gatherers, they are traditional hunter-gatherers. They always say they live the same way they have for the last 100,000 years. National Geographic loves to film them. And it would be great if we could just preserve the way of life forever. But to be a hunter-gatherer in the modern world is kind of losing at a game of musical chairs, because you traditionally go from here, 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 here all year. But now you try to go back to that place, someone's built a resort there. You try to go back to that place, someone's built a cattle there. And so every time you move, someone else moves onto your land until you're stuck in the scrub forests that are really hard to eke a living out of. And you can see these people were very impoverished. So I went there, I was like, oh, this sounds like a really good project. Tried to tell all the organizations I usually work for that they should do it, and all of them were like, no, we don't work in that area. So, and this was right around the time the Flow Hive was making news with all their fundraising and stuff. So, well, if they can do that, I'll try to Kickstarter or something, an organization myself. So I founded BeeAid International and registered as a nonprofit in California and tried to raise funds to do this project myself. And it turns out I'm not super good at fundraising, but I ended up doing the project anyway. So then a year later, just 1 year after that, I was back. Flew into Nairobi because it's cheaper to go there, and then traveled by bus. I was on a shoestring budget to Arusha, and then down to Singida, and then the government took me to wherever they were. I don't know. It was also kind of funny because my contact with the local government there was the regional commissioner, which I have no idea what that means, but I talked to him on the phone a few times, telling him I was coming and all this. And then when I got to Arusha, he was in Arusha, and even though he's from Singida, and he was going to give me a ride down there. And I talked to him, and he's like, okay, well, I'm in the hotel in the center of town, and you want to come over here? And I'm like, how about you come here? You've got a car, you come pick me up. And he kind of was reluctant, but he finally did, and he shows up with his car with flags on the two corners and like an entourage of people. I realized, then I Google what regional commissioner is. He is the governor of a state of several million people. And I was like, I can't believe I ordered him to come pick me up. But he's super, super nice guy. And so that was funny. And so he was the governor of the area, so he organized the local government to take me out there. It took like 3 days to get out to where the Hadza were. But before we get there, so these are stingless bee hives. So they kind of find them in a branch or a log, and they kind of, I guess, just cut off the section and take it back. This guy's got several hundred of them in close proximity here because they don't sting, so they're not going to bother anyone. But they only travel, I think, a few hundred meters, so there's obviously a lot of food for them. This is on the slopes of Kilimanjaro. What else was I going to say about this? Oh yeah, Melipona is the genus. And I've got some of his honey, some Kyrgyz honey, and some Guinean honey, if people want to try honey at the end over there. Approved by biosecurity. Don't worry about it, it's good. So that was that. Okay, so yeah, this is what Tanzania looks like, just kind of your classic African savanna. And it wouldn't be a trip into the middle of Africa without a flat tire in the absolute middle of nowhere. And for some reason, our lug nuts were too tight that our crowbar couldn't even work, but some guys passed in a truck with a really big crowbar and managed to get them off. But it was, yeah, we were stranded there for an hour in just hot sun, middle of nowhere. And then like the last leg of the journey to the Hadza people, I was actually hiking the last day. Just me and my translator bringing in all the food that we planned to eat ourselves. It was quite the adventure. My camera was stolen at the very end of the project, so the only pictures of this project I have are ones I happen to have uploaded to Instagram before the phone was stolen. So God bless Instagram, I guess. But see, the image quality is not that great. But yeah, so they're actually living in little huts like that. Here we are doing some wax rendering. Here I am just hanging out by one of the huts. Again, lots of downtime. I always bring books. Throughout Africa, they typically eat by hand, communally. I've tried it. I can't really get behind it. I don't like the weird feeling of stuff on my hand, so they found a spoon for me. And at one point, I was eating what I thought was chicken, but then I noticed the bones were way smaller than chicken, and I'm pretty sure it was like a sparrow or something. And baobab porridge is actually pretty good. These are hunter-gatherers. And so I tried to do the baseline survey like my other projects, and I was trying to ask them what their annual income is, and they're like, oh, we don't have an annual income. I'm like, clearly they don't understand the question. What have you sold in the last year? Oh, we haven't sold anything in the last year. And even though I knew in my head, I'd been going on for a year trying to fundraise, talking about how these people are hunter-gatherers, but it doesn't really click until you're there that these people have an annual income of $0 a year. They eat what they can find every day. And we go to do training, and I always try to get the women involved. It tends to be mostly men doing the beekeeping everywhere, but usually we get a few women. But we turn out there and it's all women. I'm like, where are the men? Oh, they're all hunting. Like they are literally out with bows and arrows, literally hunting for their food. I'm like, all right, this is how we're doing it then. So this is all the Hadza women. Owner of a beekeeping supply store in California had donated like a dozen brand spanking new bee suits, so brought those. So got nice shiny suits. That's the thing. And the beehives, because they hang the traditional beehives up in trees, so they had gotten these kind of modern style hives and they hung them up in trees as well. The problem with that is it's good if you're trying to get bees, because bees are more likely to occupy something that's elevated up in the air. But I always tell them once bees are in there, you need to lower it down, because you can tell me you're going to inspect your beehive, but you're not going to climb up there and inspect that beehive more than once a year if it's such a hassle to get up there. And by the time you've got it down, the bees are thoroughly stirred up, and it's just such a hassle to get them out every time. So that was a thing. Finally get it down, do some inspecting, send it back up. The beehives were really not very well made at all, so the biggest thing was just they needed to get them better made. So that was that. Don't have a lot of pictures from that, again, because the thing was stolen. And so Nicaragua is where I was in September, 2 months ago. First time actually doing a beekeeping project south of the border in the Americas. And not much to say about that because beekeeping is fairly similar. You can see volcanoes straight from the capital. This is in the airport, obviously, and that's a volcano. And I kept being like, is that normal? Is that right? Like, I don't have to like evacuate. There's a big plume of black smoke just over the horizon. So yeah, modern beehives, the only difference is they have fully Africanized bees. And so you see they got a really big smoker there. You gotta smoke the bejesus out of African bees if you wanna get them under control. They weren't really as bad as I was afraid they'd be, but you won't see any pictures of the barehanded on the frame with these. And the one thing that's interesting is in California we have Africanized bees as well, but we're still trying to fight it. And we requeen our hives. The bees will all be what the queen is, and so you get a swarm, you requeen immediately, and once her offspring take over, you have a European hive. Make sure you always have marked queens that you know are from European stock. And so we try really hard to fight it. But here they're like, no, we kill docile hives because they won't produce as well. We've just accepted, because the Africanized bees are hardy and produce well. And so like, we just accepted it, and we just, you know, if it's not really aggressive, it's not on the game plan as everyone else, and we requeen them with the Africanized bees. And so that was how they do there. I think that's the end. Are there any questions?